Hey, y'all. I'm Bud Elliott, and this is Cover 3 College Football Summer School. We've done our research on the teams, and now we're bringing on the top team experts from the 24/7 Sports Network to help us fill in the blanks. Please follow us on Twitter at Cover 3 Podcast. That's Cover 3 Podcast. And leave us a 5-star review on Apple and Spotify. All right. Class is in session. Hey guys, Bud Elliott here, and welcome back in to the Cover 3 Podcast Summer School series, where I've done my research on these teams, and now I'm going to bring on the real experts to tell me, kind of like some of the answers, fill in some of the blanks, and I'm really happy to be joined by my friend Brendan Sonnone of Noles247. Brendan, welcome to Cover 3 again.
When you said real expert, I almost gave you finger guns, and I decided against it. I'm trying to behave myself on this episode.
Finger guns, those would be solid.
There we go.
Need to have some of that bourbon in the background. There we go. Fire them off. Got some fireworks for today's show. So Florida State, Mike Norvell's second year in Tallahassee after sort of a really awkward first year, given that it was a COVID year.
That's a nice way to put it. Yeah.
A lot of Zoom install. They failed to make a bowl game, but they did show pretty good amount of improvement in all the power ratings, which I think are more translatable year to year. You're pretty sure they were an improved team, obviously, in year two.
Oh, definitely an improved team. I think we can kind of parse where they improved enough or just how much. But, well, no, I wouldn't even say just how much, because they were definitely improved. But I think in almost every area, the defense was markedly better. The offense took a while to kind of find its footing as it yo-yoed between quarterbacks. And I can be critical of the staff of how they managed the quarterback situation early in the year. But, even then they kind of found their identity and got something with Jordan Travis as the season progressed. So, yeah, I think generally you saw good positive signs of growth. You saw guys playing more cohesively and together, things that portend and point to reason to be optimistic for more growth going into the quote unquote year three for Mike Norvell.
For sure. So let's start there with that offense. Obviously, they did show quite a bit of improvement there over year one. It'd be a little bit hard not to, but they did go ahead and show it. And I say in the games that Jordan Travis, their quarterback, played the majority of the snaps, this was not that bad of an offense. Now, it was a weird offense. It just by seeing the numbers, and obviously I've also seen the games, just like you do as well, and you report on it. But it felt like there's some stuff you can really build off here with Travis.
So I was just before this first story I was doing on the quarterback situation exiting the spring. Jordan Travis is quarterback one. I don't think that's going to be in doubt at this point. I think that's pretty solidified. From the time he was officially like the starter, like when they stopped going back and forth between the two. So October 2nd was the first game he entered the starting lineup like as QB1, and they stopped the yo-yoing stuff. He had 11 passing touchdowns to 2 interceptions, Bud. His passer rating of like 150.1 was, I think, 17th among Power 5 quarterbacks. And then I didn't even factor in like the rushing yards, rushing touchdowns, and the things he does in that aspect. So he is a legitimate dual threat quarterback. I do think we're starting to see kind of what his likely ceiling is as a passer. But I think ultimately he's going to settle into be an average passing quarterback at the Power 5 level. Excuse me. Maybe a notch below it, but competent when you factor in what he can do as a passer. And so I think you have something that you can build on there. You have an identity, which is really important for offenses, especially when you don't have overwhelming talent across the board. You have to kind of find the things you do well and then really kind of hone in on them. So we saw that in the spring with the run game. I know we'll get into other things in a bit here, Bud, but I do think we're starting to see this offense being tailored to Jordan Travis's strengths, which they haven't gone into either of the last 2 seasons doing as such. They'll do that this year, and I think that'll probably lead, knock on wood, as long as he stays healthy, to consistent production from the offense.
I'm a big believer that you can kind of get a feel for a staff's feeling about their position groups by how they allocate their scholarships on the recruiting trail, but especially so in the transfer portal, because that does kind of portend of, hopefully, if you're doing it right, some instant impact. And Florida State went out and took, is it 6 new skill position players on offense, I think, or 5? Winston Wright,
4 wide receivers, and then 1 running back and Trey Benson in this.
That's a lot of new guys in the skill positions. It tells me that maybe some of the passing struggles were more than just Jordan Travis.
The wide receivers were pretty awful last year. I don't think I can massage it to sound like anything other than that. It was one of the worst in the Power 5. Certainly, watching ACC play throughout the year, and I know you're watching everything, but like it it was not pretty. And they struggled just very basic, like man beater concepts, little crossing things. The offense was super hampered by the wide receivers. Forget like winning 50-50 battles or you're getting yak, things like that. Like they just struggled to do very basic things. So yeah, they allocate 4 scholarships to the wide receiver room in the spring. And that's been a mixed bag of the newcomers. I think Micah Pittman from Oregon looks like he'll be solid. He'll be in the rotation. I don't think he's a true number 1 guy. So, FSU fans, if you're listening, don't get your hopes up in that regard. But he is someone who's going to contribute and I think be solid and be gadgety and do a few things well. So he'll help. Johnny Wilson just really, really up and down. He'll have a great practice and he'll have a practice where he puts the ball on the ground a few times. But he's 6'7". He does get open a fair amount. He does win a fair amount of 50-50 balls when he doesn't get open and has to just go up for a jump ball. There is something there. I don't know how much you can trust him right now, but I do think he has the potential to elevate the room. Really, the real knock on the wide receiver room, though, is that lack of a true number 1. And I think Winston Wright, who you mentioned, Bud, was going to be the number 1. He was a transfer from West Virginia. They had about 1,200 receiving yards combined the last 2 seasons. Just very solid, a smaller wide receiver, but really jittery and quick. And he has the offseason injury in a car accident, not his fault, leads to a leg injury, and that'll keep him out for some time. I think FSU is optimistic he'll play in 2022, but I don't have a feeling as like to how will he be 100%? Just what level will you have him with? So yeah, wide receiver, you've allocated spots there, but man, you may have to add one more this offseason because I don't know if you feel great about what you have in the passing game right now.
For sure. And another spot where they have also begun to add bodies quite a lot, even though they bring back, I think, 4 of their top 5 from last year, is the offensive line. They add Caden Lyles, they add Bless Harris, and the offensive line has kind of long been an issue for Florida State, really since Jimbo and then whiffed on the offensive line class following the national title. So we're looking at about 8 years here. Health has been a major problem there over that span. They bring in 2 transfers, as I said. This is a group that they seem to continue to recruit over better than you would expect them to, given how they've played and given their record on the field. I assume that's because of the coach.
Yeah, I think Alex Atkins has, especially this past class. I think, did they get 5 or 6 offensive linemen? Regardless,
5 pending, 5, maybe Woody,
Tay Woody, and whether he becomes eligible or not. Yeah. But start with Tay Woody. Like, everyone, I think, other than Kanaya Charlton, was like a top 400 prospect, and they had multiple 4-star guys, Julian Armella, and then the kid from Texas. I'm always blanking on his name. But he was an Under Armour All-American as well. So they had multiple guys who were like all-star caliber offensive linemen. Quayshawn Sapp was a 4-star lineman. So they had multiple guys in this class that have promise. But, it's a dicey proposition whether a true freshman can help out on the offensive line. I'm saying dicey proposition. It's unlikely. We saw Robert Scott hold his own as a true freshman 2 years ago. That's just extremely unlikely. I think internally, like Julian Armella, they think could possibly have the physical tools to help out year one. But whether that materializes is TBD, and he's not on campus.
And if you're not an early enrollee, it's tough too.
It becomes almost impossible. Again, Robert Scott did do it, so it's not impossible, but it's pretty darn hard. So yeah, it'll be transfer heavy, I think, of what you have to rely on for these contributors this year. And who knows, bud? Maybe they add 1 or 2 more in the offseason on the offensive line.
For sure. I mean, if they can get 1 more in there to give them 3 transfers, you get back 4 of your top 5 from last year. It's hard to see that group being worse, than it's been. I guess.
Even like last year, like you mentioned, 4 out of 5 of the top returners or the top players are returning on the offensive line. Devante Love-Taylor falls into the category as the one guy who is the one that isn't returning. But man, he was a shell of himself last year, and it stinks because he had a really solid 2020 season for FSU. They liked his versatility, his maturity. He was the FIU transfer. He was really solid. And then he had a knee injury late in 2020 and never got back 100% from it. He played a lot of snaps, but was a shell of himself. So in some ways, but I think there's addition by subtraction with just if you're able to start a healthy offensive line. That's how bad the depth was last year and why you're taking all these bodies, both in the transfer portal and then in the recruiting cycle as well, is because you were forced to play a far from 100% Devante Love-Taylor. They were forced to play an injured Bavion Johnson at times. They were forced to play Dylan Gibbons to transfer Notre Dame, played well, but he wasn't 100% for most of the season too. So that's where you got to get to, is a place where you can field 7 or 8 guys every few weeks and feel like there's not a huge drop off, and you can, rest someone for a week if they're not 100% in the trenches.
So turning to the defensive side of the ball here, on the defensive line, 7 of the 9 guys who played 150 plus snaps last year are back.
Okay.
But the 2 who aren't back are a fairly big deal, I would think, on a team that doesn't have that much talent. I mean, Jermaine Johnson is, I think, exceeded certainly my expectations, probably the staff's expectations too, if you give him the truth serum.
Yeah.
I don't know. They thought they were going to take a backup at Georgia and make him into a top 10 draft pick
in
1 year. Is there any way they avoid a drop-off along the defensive line?
No, there will be a... So the defensive line collectively, I have reason to be optimistic about it because of what they bring back along the interior of the defensive line. It's Fabian Lovett and Robert Cooper, multi-year starters, and they were really solid last year. And you bring back their top reserves as well, and then you bring in some freshmen as well. So the depth at defensive tackles should be good. I do think overall you will have a drop off in production. We're talking about defensive end and defensive line, but I still think it could be one of the better units, if not the best unit on the team, because those defensive tackles are so strong. And there is reason for optimism at defensive end. Jared Verse, the transfer from Albany, man, he had an awesome spring. All the physical tools you could want. The energy is there. Even just like the mental aptitude. He's really smart, and he has this nice chippiness to him. But he's not as refined as Jermaine Johnson was, even coming in, even before Jermaine Johnson was the Jermaine Johnson household name. Even in the spring, you could tell that Jermaine Johnson was more refined, but it makes sense. He'd been in college for 5 years. Jared Verse has been in college for 2 or 3 years. So there's a difference there. Dennis Briggs, they like a ton. They move him from defensive tackle to defensive end. He's played defensive end some in his career, so this isn't going to be like this crazy experiment. Like there's something there, and he's coming off an injury. But I think with Briggs and Jared Verse, you have something decent there. And then Derek McClendon is going to be a solid, whether he starts or takes starting caliber reps or he's in the rotation. We'll see. I think Jared Verse probably ends the season as the starter. He's probably your superior talent, but McClendon will play a good deal. So I think you have 3 solid pieces there, but it's not Jermaine Johnson or Keir Thomas. So yeah, somewhat of a drop off with the pass rush. You have to be creative, Bud, I guess, in how you get to the quarterback.
For sure. And with the experience they have in the secondary, I know when we had Bill Connolly on the show on Cover 3, he talked about how Florida State brings back more experience in the secondary than pretty much anybody. Now Jarvis Brownlee, who was the snap leader of the defense last year, 812 snaps on defense, is off, transferred to Louisville, and yet they bring in Greedy Vance from Louisville. In your opinion, is that kind of a 1-for-1 swap, or do you feel like, what do you think about the secondary post Brownlee?
It's fine. We're going to look at it as a trade. I don't know if that's totally fair to do to both guys, but I totally understand the impulse to why. Like I've thought of it that myself too, because you're talking about a starting cornerback first starting cornerback. So it is interesting. From a talent perspective, I do like Brownlee's talent better. I think there's something more there to his game. But culturally, yeah, they were struggling with Jarvis Brownlee at the end. And Greedy Vance, I love the way he practices. He does play with a ton of energy. You can understand like why they brought him in as like a cultural guy. I don't think he's a starter though for you day one. Or if he is, it's probably more of a nickel back or something in that regard. So he's going to be valuable. He's going to be used. But Jarvis Brownlee was, like you said, Bud, an 800 plus stat guy, and that was because you didn't have better options than him last year. To be fair, the defensive back room, especially the cornerback room, is going to look a lot different than it was last season though. Omarion Cooper came on late last year. He was a true freshman who was out for the first couple of weeks of camp. And then we saw he really ended the year strong, had a really nice spring camp here. Zaire Thomas and Sam McCall will probably play as true freshmen. I don't know about early in the year, but they will eventually get in the lineup, especially Zaire Thomas. Like he wasn't on the roster last year, so he obviously wasn't pushing Brownlee. And then Renardo Green may have been the most solid cornerback throughout camp. Maybe not the highest upside, but just someone who's really, really solid. He moves from safety back to his natural position of corner and is healthy now and practicing consistently for the first time in about 2 years. So all these names I'm throwing out there were guys who weren't really in the mix for most of last season. So I do think there's reason to why Jarvis Brownlee transferred. And part of that was he looked around and didn't see assured playing time. That's part of why he ultimately leaves Florida State. So be interesting to see, but if that group's going to be better than it was last year. I think it'll be more talented. Whether that leads to more consistent, steady production, we'll see.
The last guy I want to talk about here is a similar story to Green, in that Akeem Dent is a guy who, I got to see a ton playing 7-on throughout the state. Got to see a couple of high school games. And it just felt like he had a bit of a crisis of confidence because he could never put together 4 or 5 weeks in a row where he was healthy. And now that knock on wood here, but it feels like he's finally just put together a stretch where he's healthy enough to actually train and get consistent reps. And if he takes another safety spot next to Jamie Robinson, that you could have a situation where 2 years ago your safeties were a liability, and last year they weren't necessarily great. You could have a pretty nice safety tandem within the ACC.
And then also that gives you some flexibility, like use an athlete like Shaheem Brown in sub packages, or Jarquez McClellan is very reliable at safety. He's nothing special talent wise, but they know where he's going to be. So yeah, all of a sudden you're looking at that position group and be like, yeah, there's some depth there. But last year, Bud, we had access to almost multiple practices each week. And that's something that I appreciate that Mike Norvell had opened up to the media, because it gives you a better sense of these players' journey. And by that, I think as a casual fan, or if you're not there at every practice, you're not seeing the exact availability of their player is having on a day-to-day basis. Being healthy and being able to practice at 100% and get a ton of reps in and being able to build on day-to-day and improve week to week, that translates over to Saturdays more so than I think I've ever imagined, being around the sport for this part of my career. I never really understood to this extent how important that was. And so when it was so cool, you could see guys kind of coming on with confidence, as the season went on, if they put together these healthy stretches of practice and just building on it. And Akeem Dent was one of those guys, right? He was someone who you saw him starting to catch the ball, making interceptions and creating takeaways in practice. And if you know Akeem Dent's story, that's something that was a struggle for him early in his career. But you start seeing that in practice, you start seeing him being around the ball more. And then the light bulb turns on for him. Everything clicks. And that came in the Miami game with 3 games left in the season. He had his big hit. I think it was in the second quarter. And that just gave him this confidence. He jarred the ball loose. It was just this big, devastating hit over the middle of the field. Kind of looked like the Stanford Samuels hit a little bit from about a decade or plus ago, I guess, at this point. But then he ends up having his 3 highest graded PFF games, I think, of his career consecutively, against Miami, against Boston College, against Florida. So against 3 Power 5 opponents. And that confidence that he got to end last season falls into this spring where he's been arguably, if not the top playmaker on defense, which, yeah, all of a sudden gives you something between him and Jamie Robinson's rock solid. Yeah, I think FSU feels solid with what it has at safety right now. There's reason to be optimistic for sure.
Last one here, because we are a little bit short on time. Kalen DeLoach really came on last year. Linebacker had a strong year, looking to improve on that this year. Last year overall, though, the linebacker play was kind of poor. Mm-hmm. This year, now everybody's really excited about Tatum Bethune, transfer linebacker from UCF. So depth of that spot, probably still a little sketchy, but considering the guys who were kind of bad last year are now his backups, I would assume. This will be the best linebacking core if they stay healthy since fill in the blank for me.
2013.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, but there's still huge, the drop off, and I guess 2014 wasn't as just that Terrence Smith was hurt a lot that year, if I recall correctly, and Reggie
Matthew Thomas was sometimes available, sometimes not.
Yeah, Matthew Thomas had that 2016 season that was kind of this 1 year. It was just very Matthew Thomas-y, very unicorny of him to have just one season where you're like, hey, there's something there. But yeah, it's been a while since I think you feel consistently good about the linebacker room. And that 2013 room was great with Telvin Smith there. But this won't be close to that. But it's just I think that more points to just how inconsistent the linebacker room has been the last decade or so. Tatum Bethune, I think, is going to be rock solid, man. He's not flashy. I don't know if he's an NFL caliber player. My gut is probably not. And if so, he'll have some limitations, I think, size wise, but he moves well. He's really physical. He's really smart. And I think that's going to give him a chance to be just really solid as your MAC linebacker. And then if you're able to have, Mike linebacker, then if you're able to have Kalen DeLoach, what Tatum Bethune does for you at a linebacking unit is he becomes your number 1. So he turns last year's number 1 in Kalen DeLoach to your number 2 linebacker. He takes your number 2 linebacker from last year in DJ Lundy, makes him your number 3 in a backup. Amari Gaynor can now be used more situationally, which there is a value to Amari Gaynor situationally, just that they haven't been able to make him a down-to-down player throughout his career with multiple coaching staffs. So you don't necessarily have to use him in that role now if he's your 4th guy. So I think that's really what Tatum Bethune does, is he kind of elevates your linebacker play because he forces guys to, or he doesn't force guys to play in roles they're not comfortable with. He allows you to do more things situationally. The one thing I'll say about it is DJ Lundy did legitimately lose good weight this offseason. And we even saw in the spring game, like he makes plays in space now. Not, I think, to the extent that you need at a Power 5 linebacker. You have to be at a high end level, but it may not be this glaring liability now. And we know he's good against the run. So I'm kind of bullish on the linebacker room, to be honest.
There you go.
Yep.
Brendan Sonnone, Noles247. Follow him on Twitter. Hit up Noles247 for all the great scoop and continued coverage, especially with the transfer portal. Listen to On the Bench, the fantastic podcast from those guys over there at Noles247. Brendan, really appreciate you joining us here on Cover 3 Summer School.
Thank you, bud.
All right, that's the bell. Cover 3 College Football Summer School is over for today. But don't worry, we'll be back soon with even more episodes filling you in on the top teams in college football. Please give us those 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Follow us on YouTube and on Twitter at Cover 3 Podcast. And we'll see y'all soon.